Hello, friends of Studio Brule. This is Steve Brule, and it is coffee time. As you know, this is a time where I go over some of the things that have come across my desk over the last day or two. And I'm going to draw your attention to my VIP club member to the patriarchy, which authorizes me to comment on all the evils of the feminist empire that spread its thousands of tentacles all the way around the world. Now, the topic today is the individual versus the Borg, which is, in fact, the correct political spectrum. It's been identified as right, left, and we'll go through those terms as well. But there's also an article I'm going to be drawing on heavily here in this conversation, written in Forbes magazine about 6 years ago. And the author very accurately and logically analyzes why right-left divide is best understood as the individual versus statism, and not as fascism versus communism, as has been often done with sleight of hand from the left. So we'll go over that shortly. First, I want to go over a development at the New York Times because it's quite interesting. The New York Times is, of course, a famously leftist magazine, has been for a long time, and has been involved in all kinds of controversies, up to and including completely fabricating news stories. I don't know if you folks remember, but there was a fellow working at New York Times who got all kinds of awards for his so-called journalism. And it turned out that he was completely fabricating news stories and even sources. And nobody at the New York Times checked because they liked his stories. They fit the narrative. And that's the story of the New York Times today. So let's have a look at the development of somebody who just left the New York Times. And this was in Fox News reported on this. Say hi to some of the regulars here, and I'm going to keep going straight into the material. Reading from the top, Bari Weiss announces she's leaving New York Times in scathing resignation letter. This just came out a couple days ago. Let's read a couple of quotes from this. I joined the paper with gratitude and optimism 3 years ago. I was hired with the goal of bringing voices that would not otherwise appear on your pages. First-time writers, centrists, conservatives, and others who would not naturally think of the Times as their home. The reason for this effort was clear. The paper's failure to anticipate the outcome of the 2016 election meant that it didn't have a firm grasp of the country it covers. That is an understatement, to be sure. Sorry about a little loss of connection there. That's an understatement, to be sure. The New York Times is so out of touch with the country itself, and they've been relying on the same pollsters who are also out of touch. Pollsters who now are coming to realize that the people they poll aren't feeling safe to actually express their actual opinion, so they keep quiet. And that's the thing. It is not safe to express a contrary opinion to the collective narrative that's being pushed at us day in and day out in the Western world. And that's a feminist narrative, because feminism dominates all the institutions of our culture. But let's read on. Reading from the top. But the lessons that ought to have followed the election, lessons about the importance of understanding other Americans, the necessity of resisting tribalism, and the centrality of the free exchange of ideas to a democratic society have not been learned. No kidding. In fact, we're going in the opposite direction, at least if you listen to the narratives pushed by the left-wing media and all these BLMs and Antifa peoples. Instead, a new consensus has emerged in the press, but perhaps especially at this paper, the New York Times, that truth isn't a process of collective discovery, but an orthodoxy already known to an enlightened few whose job is to inform everyone else. That's right. These enlightened few have created a narrative at great expense and a lot of time, by the way, which is why they're so insistent on sticking to their narrative. But they are pushing a narrative. They are not seeking the truth. No one here at Studio Brule is going to be surprised or object to that conclusion for sure. But the majority of the Western public appear, at least, maybe it's not a majority, but a sizable amount of the Western world's public are eating up the leftist narrative from organizations like the New York Times. They're eating it hook, line, and sinker. Let's read on. My own forays into wrongthink have made me the subject of constant bullying by colleagues who disagree with my views. They have called me a Nazi and a racist. I have learned to brush off comments about how I'm writing about the Jews again. Several colleagues perceived to be friendly with me were badgered by coworkers. And this is typical everywhere we see the Borg. And I am starting now to refer to this collectivist wokeness as the Borg, and they are the Borg. And we're going to get into that in more detail in a few minutes. But we've seen this ever since we started covering events and lectures by dissidents on university campuses. They're shut down. They're extremely aggressive. They try to shut you up. They pull fire alarms to shut you off, and they attack people. This is the leftist woke Borg that we're talking about here. Let's carry on. I do not understand how you have allowed this kind of behavior to go on inside your company in full view of the paper's entire staff and the public. And I certainly can't square how you and other Times leaders have stood by while simultaneously praising me in private for my courage. Showing up for work as a centrist at an American newspaper should not require bravery, but it does today. Everyone who subscribes to Studio Brule and the Honey Badgers and An Ear for Men and so many other, the National Coalition for Men and Families, Canadian Association for Men and Families, all of you are the brave ones because we go against the narrative. We're not being told what to think and how to think it. And we're not bending the knee to the threat of violence and silence and the elimination of our presumption of innocence and all of those things. We are resisting the Borg. That is exactly what we're doing. We're taking the red pill, which is another way to put it, but it's resisting the Borg as well. And the left, the collectivists, the woke, those are the Borg. Let's read from the top. Part of me wishes I could say that my experience was unique, but the truth is that intellectual curiosity, let alone risk-taking, is now a liability at the Times. Why edit something challenging to our readers or write something bold only to go through the numbing process of making it ideologically kosher when we can assure ourselves of job security and clicks by publishing our 4,000th op-ed arguing that Donald Trump is a unique danger to the country and the world? And so self-censorship has become the norm. Has it ever become the norm? I'm noticing this all over the place nowadays. People are resisting saying things that they might think because people are becoming so afraid to garner the wrath of the Borg. And that's what's going on. This is a really enormous danger to the Western way of life, to freedom, to liberty, to presumption of innocence and freedom of speech. Let's carry on. Reading from the top. What rules that remain at the Times are applied with extreme selectivity. If a person's ideology is in keeping with the new orthodoxy, they and their work remain unscrutinized. Everyone else lives in fear of the digital Thunderdome. Online venom is excused so long as it is directed at the proper targets. That's right. That is a state that we're coming to in our Western world today. And this woman is one of the few with a cushy job, or once had a cushy job, but can't stand it because she has integrity and left the New York Times. Not very many people willingly leave the New York Times because it is a cushy job, and it's still, in spite of the fact that the New York Times has been printing outright lies and caught in all kinds of scandals and fake news, amazingly, it still retains the majority of its positive reputation. I don't understand it. It is a rag, an absolute piece of crap magazine, newspaper. Can't call it news when you're making up news. It's a fantasy. It's a narrative they're using to control the left woke Borg. Let's read onwards here. Standing up for principle for principle that the paper does not win plaudits. It puts a target on your back. Too wise to post on Slack, they write to me privately about the new McCarthyism that has taken root at the paper of record. Right through the left, that's what it is. Rule 1. These are unspoken rules at the New York Times. Speak your mind at your own peril. Rule 2. Never risk commissioning a story that goes against the narrative. Rule 3. Never believe an editor or publisher who urges you to go against the grain. Eventually, the publisher will cave to the mob, the editor will get fired or reassigned, and you'll be hung out to dry. We've seen this over and over and over again. And you don't have to wait very long for the publisher or the owner of these papers to cave to the mob. It's minutes. It's often in minutes now. They don't even pause to analyze the situation or consider whether they should be supporting their employees. Why would anyone work at such a propaganda crap magazine? Kudos to her for leaving and having the courage to leave and speak up about it. I hope this starts a trend. Okay, so we're going to get straight into the next topic here, and that is why. It's not my idea. This is a fellow here, and this was written back in, read the date here, 2013, folks. 2013, almost 7 years ago we're talking about. This fellow writing at Forbes magazine identified the fact that the true political spectrum is right is individuality and capitalism. The left is collectivism, statism, the Borg. And that is not an exaggeration in any manner. And I'm going to go over this article in some detail because, and with more quotes than usual, because this article I think is very, very important. We have been, and the author here is going to open up very quickly in the first paragraph with the key, one of the keys to this entire discussion. This was a trick by the lefts to associate fascism with the right side and communism with the left, when in fact both of these are collectivist, statist movements. That is not the left and the right. Let's get straight into it here because this is a really important article. This should be known by anyone who's and understood by anyone and everyone who's going to talk about politics today, especially today. Statism, whether fascist or communist, it's the deadly opposite of capitalism. Let's read it again. Statism, whether fascist or communist, it's the deadly opposite of capitalism. So let's get into the meat of this. This is probably the most important political article written this century so far, as pertains to the West. Reading from the top. Over the last few years, a new and immensely clarifying concept has entered public discussion: statism. It's been said that he who controls language controls history. The growing use of statism may portend a political sea change because it pierces a major leftist-created smoke screen, the placing of fascism on the right. I find this to be the most important groundwork of understanding the political spectrum that I've seen in a long time. Let's read from the top. This twisting of language and facts has reached ludicrous levels. On November 9th, the New York Times featured a page one article whose headline blared, "Right Wing's Surge in Europe Has the Establishment Rattled." But it turns out that these alleged rightists, quote, want to strengthen, not shrink government, and they see the welfare state as an integral part of their national identities. How is this capitalism? How is this individualistic? It is not. It is the opposite. The article reveals that, quote, the platform of France's National Front reads in part like a leftist manifesto. And that's what it is. And I remember these things happening at that time 7-8 years ago when they were complaining about a rise of rightism in Europe, when in fact it's statism that was rising. Let's read from the top. Suppose that someone proposed a right-left axis for eating, saying that the extreme right is to eat arsenic and the extreme left is to eat cyanide. The choice would only be, which poison do you want to die from? And the moderates, quote, would then be those who eat a mixture of arsenic and cyanide. And what would be omitted from this setup? Food. And that's what's omitted from our left-right political divide today. We're going to get more into this now. Reading from the top, the political equivalent of the arsenic cyanide spectrum is the fascism communism spectrum. What is omitted from the setup is a free society, which means capitalism. What is the actual opposite of capitalism? Statism. Statism versus capitalism. And we're going to see here he makes the argument for individualism and capitalism as being united on the right side. Reading onward. Fascism and communism are two variants of statism. Both are forms of dictatorship. Neither one recognizes individual rights, and here is where he gets to the crutch of it, nor permits individual freedom. The differences are non-essential. Fascism is racial statism, and communism is statism of economic class. And, as we know today, feminism is Marxism. They're seeking a Marxist society. They're statists. They want to expand government. Let's read from the top. Communism advocates the abolition of private property. Socialism advocates government ownership of the means of production. Fascism leaves that property in private hands, and this is the key, then shackles those hands, every economic decision being directed by the state. Property rights are non-existent under fascism. Let's read on. All property is common property, wrote Nazi spokesman Ernst Huber. The owner is bound by the people and Reich to the responsible management of his goods. His legal position is only justified when he satisfies his responsibility to the community. Communism. There are no personal liberties of the individual which fall outside of the realm of the state and which must be respected by the state. And there you have it. Fascism, like communism, obliterates the individual and eliminates all individual rights, which eliminates all of your freedom, all of your liberty, all of your presumption of innocence. You are part of the Borg in any statism, whether communistic or fascistic, it doesn't matter. Let's read on. Both communism and fascism establish total censorship and tolerate no freedom of thought. Aren't we seeing that in spades with feminism and the BLM and the woke left? Thus rejecting rights in the spiritual realm as well. Nazi writer Friedrich Seeberg stated, there are to be no more private Germans. Each is to attain significance only by his service to the state. How is that? How is that substantially different from communism? Let's read from the top. Few on the left care to remember that Nazi is a shortening of, I can't read that German, but in English it means National Socialist German Workers' Party. National Socialist, Communist. Let's read on. Whether the dictatorship claims the mantle of the Aryan race or the proletariat matters little to the individuals crushed by it. To search for some trivial superiority of the Soviet gulags over the Nazi concentration camps or vice versa would be morally obscene. And yet, we're been told that fascism sits on one side and communism on the other. And this is the main political error of the political spectrum that we need to correct immediately and spread this widely throughout the culture. Let's read on. So, we observe a fundamental difference. One system grants the state unlimited power, holding that the individual is the rightless slave of the state. The other system holds individual rights to be supreme and inalienable, with the state limited to a single function, the protection of those rights from physical force and fraud. That's the correct political spectrum. Individualism on one side, statism, collectivism on the other side. The Borg versus the individual. That's the political spectrum that we actually see at work in the world in the West. Reading from the top, that is a distinction that must be made. We can expect no clarity in political discussion until the pure, consistent poles are identified. The opposition between dictatorship and liberty, between the individual as the nothing and the individual as sovereign. Left and right have to be defined accordingly. And let's make no mistake about it here, and he's going to clarify this shortly. We don't live in a purely capitalist West. Even the most capitalist of the states or of the European countries is not a purely capitalist. It's not purely individualist. Individuals are still not sovereign. But that pure individually, that individual sovereignty does represent a pole on the political spectrum. And the other pole is absolutely no individual rights. That the individual is a slave owned by the state who has no meaning except for his service to the state. That is statism. That is collectivism. That is the woke left. That is the Borg. Let's read on. From the top, but left and right are informal shorthand. The actual terms are statism on the left and capitalism on the right. The term statism carries its meaning on its face, but the term capitalism does not, and it has to be rescued from a century and a half of distortion, lies, and compromises. Reading from the top. This is a really great paragraph here. So sorry for its length. I don't know if you can read it from the small print, but let me read it to you. A government that taxes 40% or more of our income, that controls our Medicare, that regulates business so thoroughly that every firm large enough to afford it has a department of compliance, a government that controls the money supply, sets bank reserve ratios, regulates stock offerings, margin ratios, home construction, determines what pharmaceuticals and medical innovations can be sold, operates schools and universities, runs the passenger rail system, forbids offensive speech, increasingly intervenes in diet, subsidized agriculture, and green businesses, quote green, imposes tariffs, decides which businesses may merge, and, as we have just learned, spies on its own citizens, is not a government remotely consistent with capitalism. We do not, in other words, live in a truly capitalist society. That is another lie of the left and a bit of a self-fooled belief on many other people outside of the left. We do not truly live in an individualistic capitalist society. We're far down from that right. We're far more centrist. Even in our most capitalistic, so-called capitalistic time periods of history, we've still been very much more centrist. As this list, and it's only a partial list, describes, it is filled with collectivist, statist items. And this was written, 7, 8 years ago? We're far more to the left even than then. Let's read on. The closest the world ever came to actual capitalism was the United States in the 19th century, the era of this country's fastest economic growth. Even in that era, the capitalist industrial North had to fight a bloody civil war to end the South's infamous anti-capitalist institution, slavery. Slavery was an anti-capitalist, collectivist institution. The very nature of slavery is the very nature of the Borg, but the individual is owned. In the case of slavery, the slave owner was a sort of stand-in for the state. It is capitalism and individualism, which is liberty and freedom. And it doesn't exist in the pure sense anywhere in the world. Reading on, to defend capitalism is a task for another time. The point of this column is deeper. It is that the political spectrum, left versus right, must be defined in terms of statism versus individual liberty. Amen. And that is the only way that we can have an accurate political discussion to understand what is at stake today, especially coming up with this US election in which the leftists want to bring in a Democrat Party which is Marxist, which is supporting all the removal of freedoms that we object. We object to the removal of these freedoms. It is the Democrat Party that stands for statism, that collectivism. It is the Democrat Party that is supporting and encouraging the growth of the Borg. And it is the Borg, there is no life in the Borg. The Borg is death. And on the other side, I have to admit, there is no life in total individual sovereignty either. We as human beings have to find that compromise ground in which we recognize our rights and protect our rights as individuals, our presumption of innocence, our freedom of speech. We have to protect our individualism while recognizing that there are common needs out there. And we have to resist the Borg. The Borg crushes the individual, obliterates the individual. There is no life in it. It is the direction of death. We don't have any political movement anywhere in the known world today, anywhere in the world today, which is actually at the right pole of individualism. It doesn't exist. But we do have a movement that wants, and we have seen what happens when the left pole does get its pure implementation, and it is pure death. It is the Borg. Resist the Borg. Let's read on. I wanted to repeat this last, and this is, I'm repeating here the part of the opening paragraph because this is so important. There has been a smokescreen. This is the leftists defining fascism on the right is their smokescreen. It is them hiding the fact that they are the statists. By claiming that the statists are on the right, this is a kind of usurping the moral high ground. It's a trick. It's a trick, a smokescreen that's been perpetuated for a long, long time. By saying that fascism is not us, that's statism on the other side of the spectrum, they have encouraged and deceived people to come to the left because that's not statism. But that's a lie. That's not fascism. Fascism and communism are two faces of the same coin, and they both are on the left. They are statists, and they both want to crush the life out of every individual. That's what we're fighting against. Let's read this statement because this is really important. It's how he opens, in a way. The growing use of statism may portend a political sea change because it pierces the major leftist created smokescreen, the lie created by the left, that of placing fascism on the right in order to be able to point to the right and say, see, you don't want that. That is fascism over there, when in fact they are sitting square on the throne of fascism themselves. There's no distinction. They're twin sisters. I'll read it again. Leftist created smokescreen, the placing of fascism on the right. And that is the truth, folks. Capitalism Let's repeat it one more time, and then I'm done for the day. Statism is collectivism. It is the woke SJW. It is the Borg. Capitalism is individualism. It requires presumption of innocence and freedom of speech. It is freedom. It is liberty. The purpose of the state in capitalism is to protect that freedom. Protect those freedoms. Protect your presumption of innocence. Protect your individuality. That is the battle at hand today. Marxist feminism, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, they are the Borg. They intend to destroy capitalism. That is the intent, to destroy individualism. That is, in fact, the intent to destroy you and me, take away our rights. They've been at it for decades. They've had success in reducing the presumption of innocence and restricting your freedoms of speech. It is the Borg. It seeks to destroy individualism and create the woke collective, the Borg. We can't let it happen. So I want to recognize Oki Migtau. Thank you so much for your support of Studio Brule, Oki. And Oki says, Yuri Bezmenov talked about this 40 years ago. That's right. He's a defector from Russia who gave some, I think he was the subject of a documentary on this very topic. So thank you, folks, for joining me again at Coffee with Steve. And tomorrow I'm going to start looking at what it is to leave the West, what it's like to live in the Dominican Republic. I've been getting questions on this, and I've been slow to getting around to creating that video. So I'm going to do an informal coffee session, just answering some of the questions that folks have had. And if you have questions about what it is like practical questions or any kind of questions, email me, and I'll try to answer them tomorrow in a brief coffee session. So having said that, do something you love every single day, including today. Even though things are going to get worse and we're surrounded by enemies, you have to live your life so that at the end of your life, you're contented, satisfied, and you feel good about your life. So do something you love today, and we'll see you tomorrow.